Mail-order bride arrived in town, but the groom was hanging from a tree. She traveled 800 miles with a wedding dress and a stranger's promise, only to find her groom hanging dead from a tree. But that wasn't the worst part. When she discovered the box of letters from 30 other women, she realized Samuel Crawford hadn't just stolen her heart. He'd built an empire of broken dreams, and she was the only bride lucky enough to survive. The stagecoach lurched to a halt with a grinding screech of iron against wood, and Eleanor Whitmore felt her stomach drop along with her dreams. 8 days of bone-rattling travel had brought her to this place, Perdition Creek, Arizona territory, where the dust hung in the air like flour sifted through a widow's fingers. She pressed her palm against the cracked leather seat and peered through the window at what was supposed to be her new home. The town stretched before her like a collection of broken teeth, weathered buildings leaning against each other as if too tired to stand alone. The main street was nothing more than packed earth, scarred by wagon wheels and horse hooves, bordered by a general store, a saloon with peeling paint, and a handful of structures that might charitably be called homes. But it was the silence that struck her first, the unnatural quiet of a place holding its breath. Eleanor clutched the faded daguerreotype in her gloved hand, the corners worn soft from months of handling. Samuel Crawford's face stared back at her from the sepia tones, serious and square-jawed, with kind eyes that had promised her safety in his careful letters. She had memorized every line of his handwriting, every word of hope he had offered a woman with nowhere else to turn. Perdition Creek, the driver called out, his voice rough as sandpaper. "End of the line, miss." She gathered her carpet bag, everything she owned tied up in worn fabric and fraying rope, and stepped down into the dust. The heat hit her like a physical blow, different from the humid weight of Missouri summers. This was dry heat, the kind that pulled moisture from your lungs and left you gasping. Her dark traveling dress, proper and modest back in St. Louis, felt like a funeral shroud in this place where the sun ruled without mercy. The stagecoach driver handed down her trunk without meeting her eyes, tipped his hat, and climbed back onto his seat. Within moments, the coach was rolling away in a cloud of dust, taking with it her last connection to the world she knew. Eleanor stood alone in the street, gripping her bag like a lifeline. That was when she saw the tree. It stood in the center of town like a monument to something terrible, an ancient oak that had somehow survived in this harsh place. Its branches spread wide, offering the only shade for miles. But now those branches held something that made Eleanor's blood turn to ice water in her veins. A man hung there, swaying gently in the desert breeze. His boots pointed toward the ground like he was trying to find purchase on solid earth one last time. A crude wooden sign hung around his neck, the letters burned deep into the wood. Horse thief. Eleanor's legs went weak. The daguerreotype slipped from her fingers and fell into the dust at her feet. Because even with his face purple and swollen, even with death's mask covering his features, she recognized the square jaw and the build of the man she had traveled 800 miles to marry. Samuel Crawford hung from the hanging tree like a broken promise. The street wasn't empty, she realized. People watched from doorways and windows, faces pale as bone china in the shadows. A woman in a flour-dusted apron stood frozen in front of the general store. 2 men leaned against the saloon's porch rail, their hands resting near their gun belts. Children peered around corners like small animals, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. They were all staring at her. Eleanor tried to breathe, but the air felt thin and bitter. Her carefully planned future crumbled like desert clay in her hands. The boarding house where Samuel had promised her a room. The small church where he had written they would marry. The life they would build together, modest but honest, in this place where a woman could start fresh. All of it hung dead in the branches of that tree. She knelt in the dust and picked up the daguerreotype, brushing the dirt from Samuel's face with shaking fingers. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken questions. Was she his accomplice? His victim? Did she know what kind of man he really was? The townspeople watched and waited, their suspicion thick as the heat. Eleanor rose slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She looked at the hanging tree, at the man who had promised her marriage and safety, at the sign that branded him a thief. Then she looked at the faces watching her from the shadows, faces that might hold pity or contempt or something worse. The wind picked up, stirring the dust around her feet and setting the rope to creaking like a broken gate. Samuel's body turned slightly in the breeze, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she could hear his voice from one of his letters. "Come to me, Eleanor. We will build something good together in this hard country." But there was nothing good here. Only dust and death and the weight of shattered dreams settling over her shoulders like a funeral veil. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Eleanor stood in the center of Perdition Creek, clutching her bag and her broken hopes, while the town held its breath and waited to see what she would do next. The whole town turned their backs on her, except for one woman who knew what it meant to lose everything. But Martha Hensley's kindness came with secrets that could destroy them both. The sun had nearly touched the mountains when Martha Hensley stepped out of the shadows like a ghost given flesh. She was a small woman, her frame worn thin by hard years, but she moved with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to survive when survival seemed impossible. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her dress was the color of desert sage. Practical, faded, mended in places where the fabric had given way to time and use. Eleanor watched her approach, through eyes blurred with tears she refused to shed. The rest of the town still lingered in doorways and behind windows, their stares heavy with judgment and suspicion. But this woman walked straight toward her, her weathered boots stirring small clouds of dust with each determined step. "Child," Martha said, her voice soft as worn leather, "you can't stand here all night." Up close, Eleanor could see the lines carved deep around Martha's eyes. Not laugh lines, but the kind etched by squinting into harsh sun and harsher truths. Her hands, folded at her waist, were the hands of a woman who had washed dishes and mended clothes and buried loved ones with equal care. "I don't know where else to go," Eleanor whispered, the words catching in her throat like thorns. She glanced toward the hanging tree, where Samuel's body still turned slowly in the evening breeze. "He promised me. He said there would be a place for me here." Martha followed her gaze to the tree, and something flickered across her weathered features. Pain, maybe, or guilt. She was quiet for a long moment, studying Eleanor's face as if trying to read a difficult letter. Around them, the town held its breath, waiting to see what the widow would do. "Samuel Crawford made a lot of promises," Martha said finally. Her voice carried the weight of knowledge, of secrets Eleanor didn't yet understand. "Cool me. You'll stay with me tonight." A murmur ran through the watching crowd like wind through dry grass. Eleanor heard fragments of whispered warnings. Don't trust her, and she might be part of it. And what if she knew? But Martha paid them no mind. She bent down and picked up Eleanor's trunk as if it weighed nothing, though Eleanor could see the strain in her shoulders. "Mrs. Hensley," called out a voice from the saloon porch. It belonged to a man with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, his face hard as flint. "You sure that's wise? We don't know what she might have been involved in." Martha straightened and fixed the deputy with a look that could have withered cactus flowers. "Tom Bradley. I've been taking in travelers since before you were old enough to pin on that badge. I'll decide who sleeps under my roof." The deputy's face reddened, but he said nothing more. Martha turned back to Eleanor and nodded toward a narrow building at the end of the street. A wooden sign hung above its door, the paint faded but still readable. Hensley House, clean rooms, fair rates. They walked in silence past the staring faces, past the general store where the woman in the flour-dusted apron quickly turned away, past the saloon where men leaned against the rails like vultures waiting for carrion. Eleanor's carpetbag felt heavier with each step, weighted down not just with her possessions, but with the crushing realization that her life had become something entirely different from what she had planned. The boarding house was small but clean, its windows glowing with the warm light of oil lamps. Martha pushed open the door and ushered Eleanor inside, where the smell of beans and cornbread lingered in the air like a memory of comfort. The main room held a handful of mismatched chairs arranged around a stone fireplace, and a dining table scarred by years of use. "Sit," Martha said, guiding Eleanor to a chair near the window. "I'll get you some coffee." Eleanor sank into the chair and watched Martha move around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency. Her movements were economical, wasting no motion, like someone who had learned to make every gesture count. She poured coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm on the stove and brought it to Eleanor in a chipped ceramic cup. The coffee was bitter and strong, but it was warm, and warmth was something Eleanor desperately needed. She wrapped her hands around the cup and let the heat seep into her fingers while Martha settled into the chair across from her. "How long did you know him?" Martha asked. Her voice was gentle, but Eleanor heard the carefulness in it, the way someone might approach a wounded animal. 6 months, Eleanor said. "We corresponded. He seemed kind, honest." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He wrote about wanting to build something good here. A life. A family." Martha was quiet for a long moment, staring into her own coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions she was afraid to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband died 3 years ago, kicked by a horse while he was shoeing it. Quick death, which was a mercy, I suppose." She looked up at Eleanor, and there was something in her eyes that might have been understanding. Samuel was his business partner. They ran a small freight operation, hauling supplies between here and Tucson. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. "Was he? Did your husband know what Samuel was?" "No," Martha said, but the word came too quickly, and Eleanor heard the lie in it like a false note in a hymn. "James was a good man, honest as the day is long." They sat in silence as the shadows lengthened outside the window. Eleanor could hear the sounds of the town settling into evening. Doors closing, horses being led to stables, the distant laughter from the saloon. Normal sounds of normal life, while she sat in a stranger's kitchen trying to understand how her world had collapsed so completely. "Why did you help me?" Eleanor asked finally. "Everyone else was ready to run me out of town." Martha set down her coffee cup and folded her hands in her lap. For a moment, she looked every one of her years, worn thin by loss and loneliness and the weight of surviving in a place that showed no mercy to weakness. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," she said. "And because—" She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Because maybe I owed you something. Maybe we all did." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, Martha rose from her chair and moved toward the narrow staircase that led to the upper floor. "I'll show you to your room. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As they climbed the stairs, Eleanor caught a glimpse of Martha's face in the lamplight, and what she saw there made her stomach tighten with new worry. Because beneath the kindness and the offer of shelter, she glimpsed something else, guilt, deep and painful as an old wound that had never properly healed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of sage and dust and secrets that had been buried too long in the hard ground of Perdition Creek. She thought Samuel Crawford had only broken her heart, until she discovered the box of letters from dozens of other women and realized she wasn't his victim. She was just the lucky one who lived. 3 days passed in the boarding house like prayers whispered in darkness. Eleanor learned the rhythm of Martha's world. The early morning sweep of dust from the front steps, the careful rationing of water for washing, the quiet preparation of simple meals from ingredients stretched to their limit. She mended torn curtains with careful stitches and helped scrub the wooden floors until they gleamed in the lamplight. Work was a blessing in this place, a way to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on the rope that still creaked in the town center. Martha taught her without words, showing her how to make coffee stretch further with chicory root, how to darn socks so the repairs barely showed, how to read the signs in a traveler's face that told you whether they had money for a room or just seeking shelter from the desert wind. It was knowledge born of necessity, the hard-earned wisdom of a woman who had learned to survive when survival was its own kind of victory. Eleanor found herself grateful for the widow's silence during the daylight hours. Neither woman spoke of Samuel, or the hanging tree, or the whispers that followed Eleanor whenever she stepped outside to hang laundry or fetch water from the well. The town watched her with the patient attention of buzzards, waiting to see if she would break, if she would confess to crimes they were certain she had committed, if she would simply disappear back into the desert from which she had come. But it was in the darkness that the real truth began to surface. Eleanor woke on the third night to the smell of smoke. Not the dangerous kind that meant fire, but the controlled burn of paper feeding carefully tended flames. She rose from her narrow bed and padded barefoot to the window, where moonlight painted the world in shades of silver and shadow. Below, in the small courtyard behind the boarding house, she could see Martha kneeling beside a metal wash basin, feeding something to the flames that danced within it. Curiosity overcame caution. Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the steps she had learned would creak and betray her presence. The back door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see Martha's face illuminated by firelight, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks like desert rain. Papers curled and blackened in the basin, but not so quickly that Eleanor couldn't read the writing on them. Letters. Dozens of them, all addressed in the same careful hand. Samuel Crawford, Perdition Creek, Arizona Territory. The return addresses came from places scattered across the frontier, towns in Texas and New Mexico and California, places where lonely women had written their hopes and dreams to a man who had promised them love. Eleanor pushed through the door, and Martha looked up with the startled expression of someone caught in a private act of penance. "How many?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha's hands stilled on the letters she was about to consign to flames. In the firelight, her face looked carved from stone, ancient and weathered by secrets too heavy to carry. "I stopped counting after 30, she said. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She sank down onto the wooden step, her legs too weak to support the weight of this new understanding. 30 women, 30 lives touched by Samuel Crawford's lies. 30 dreams built on promises he never intended to keep. "Tell me," Eleanor said. Martha set aside the remaining letters and wiped her hands on her apron, leaving dark smudges on the faded fabric. "He started writing to women about a year ago. Said it was just for companionship at first, to ease the loneliness. James, my husband, he thought it was harmless enough. A man gets lonely out here, and women back east, they get desperate for a new start." She paused, staring into the flames as if they might burn away the guilt that had been eating at her for months. But then the money started coming. Small amounts at first. $5 here, $10 there. The women would send what they could to help with wedding preparations, to buy household goods, to secure their passage west. Eleanor felt sick. "And you knew?" "I knew," Martha said, the words falling from her lips like stones dropped into deep water. "God help me. I knew, and I said nothing. Samuel was charming when he wanted to be, and he made it sound so reasonable. These women were willing to pay for a chance at happiness," he said. "We were just providing a service." The flames crackled between them, consuming the evidence of Samuel's deception letter by letter. Eleanor watched her own correspondence disappear into ash and wondered how many other women had written similar words, had poured their hearts on a paper for a man who saw them only as sources of easy money. "The horses," Eleanor said, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. "He was stealing horses to fund this. To keep up the pretense." Martha nodded, fresh tears cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "He needed money to send gifts, to make himself seem prosperous and stable. Little things at first, a locket, a pressed flower, a photograph." The women wrote back with such gratitude, such hope. It became like a fever with him. The more money he collected, the more elaborate the lies became. Eleanor thought of her own pressed flower, carefully preserved between the pages of her Bible, and felt something cold settle in her chest. How many were supposed to come here? How many were told they were the only one? 7, Martha whispered. 7 women in the past 6 months who sold everything they owned to come west and marry Samuel Crawford. You were just the first to actually make the journey. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the snap of burning paper and the distant cry of a coyote somewhere in the desert darkness. Eleanor tried to imagine it. 6 other women like herself, sitting in small rooms in distant towns, counting their savings and planning their futures with a man who had never intended to honor a single promise he had made. What happened to the others? Why didn't they come? Martha reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small stack of letters, these unburned. Some got suspicious when he kept postponing the wedding date. Others couldn't raise the money for passage. A few wrote to say they had changed their minds. She held up one letter, her hand trembling. This woman named Sarah from Fort Worth. She wrote to say she was coming anyway, that she had managed to secure passage on a freight wagon. That letter arrived the day after they hanged Samuel. Eleanor took the letter with numb fingers and read Sarah's eager words by firelight. The woman wrote of her excitement, of the dress she had sewn for her wedding, of her plans to help Samuel build a life in Arizona. She was supposed to arrive in Perdition Creek in 2 weeks' time. She'll come, Eleanor said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She'll come just like I did, expecting to find husband, and instead she'll find nothing, Martha finished. Nothing but a hanging tree and a town full of people who will look at her the same way they looked at you. They sat in silence, watching the last of the letters turn to ash. The fire began to die, leaving them in darkness broken only by silver moonlight and the weight of shared guilt. Eleanor understood now why Martha had helped her, why the widow had defied the town's suspicion to offer shelter to a stranger. It wasn't just kindness, it was penance. We have to stop this, Eleanor said finally. We have to warn them. Martha looked up at her with something that might have been hope flickering in her tired eyes. How? We don't even know where they all are. Some of those letters came from places I've never heard of. Eleanor stood and gathered the unburned letters from Martha's lap, holding them against her chest like a shield. Then we'll find them. We'll write to every town, every territory office, every church that might help us reach them. And we'll tell them the truth. The wind picked up, scattering ash from the wash basin across the courtyard like snow. In the distance, the hanging tree creaked its eternal song, but for the first time since Eleanor had arrived in Perdition Creek, the sound didn't fill her with despair. Instead, it sounded like a call to action, a reminder that some debts could only be paid with truth, and that redemption sometimes came disguised as the hardest work you could imagine. They couldn't bring back the dead or undo the lies, but 2 women with nothing left to lose decided to plant something honest in ground that had only known deception and watched a whole town learn what redemption really looks like. Dawn broke over Perdition Creek with the promise of rain, the first real promise the sky had made in months. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, watching gray clouds gather over the mountains like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to speak. The air felt different, charged with possibility and the clean scent of moisture that made the desert hold its breath in anticipation. Behind her, Martha worked at the kitchen table, her weathered hands moving with steady purpose as she addressed another envelope. They had been writing for 2 weeks now, sending letters to every town office, every church, every women's aid society they could think of, warning Sarah from Fort Worth, warning women whose names they had found in Samuel's correspondence, warning anyone who might listen that Samuel Crawford was dead and his promises had died with him. That's the last one, Martha said, sealing the envelope with careful precision. Letter to the territorial governor's office in Tucson. If that doesn't reach the women who still believe Samuel's lies, nothing will. Eleanor turned from the window and studied the small pile of letters stacked on the table. Each one represented hours of careful writing, words chosen to convey truth without cruelty, hope without false comfort. They had used most of Martha's meager savings for postage, and Eleanor had contributed the last of her traveling money, the coin she had saved for her wedding dress, now repurposed for a different kind of salvation. Do you think it will be enough? Eleanor asked. Martha rose from her chair and walked to the stove, where coffee was brewing in the same battered pot they had shared that first night. Her movements were slower now, aged by the weight of confession and the hard work of making amends, but there was something different in her posture, a straightness in her shoulders that spoke of burdens finally shared. "It has to be," she said. "We've done what we can with the truth. The rest is up to them." A knock at the front door interrupted their quiet morning ritual. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Visitors to the boarding house had been rare since Samuel's hanging, and those who came usually brought suspicion rather than business. But when Martha opened the door, they found not the stern face of Deputy Bradley or the hostile stares of townspeople, but Sarah Wilkins from the general store, her flour-dusted apron replaced by a clean blue dress. "Mrs. Hensley," Sarah said, her voice hesitant but determined. "Miss Whitmore, I was wondering, that is, my husband and I were discussing, we heard you might be taking sewing work." Eleanor blinked in surprise. Word of her needlework had somehow spread through the town, despite the walls of suspicion that had surrounded the boarding house. She had spent her evenings mending clothes and hemming curtains, working by lamplight to contribute to their shared expenses, but she hadn't expected anyone to take notice. "I do some sewing," Eleanor said carefully. "Simple mending, mostly." Sarah stepped forward, pulling a bundle of fabric from her basket. "My daughter's wedding dress," she said, her voice catching slightly. "The hem needs adjusting, and there's delicate lacework that needs repair. I know you don't owe this town anything, but, well, Margaret heard about your skill with fine needlework, and she specifically asked if you might consider." The request hung in the air between them like a bridge neither woman was certain could bear weight. Eleanor took the bundle of white silk and lace, running her fingers over fabric that reminded her painfully of her own wedding dress, still folded carefully in her trunk upstairs. "I'll do it," Eleanor said. "No charge for the first dress. Consider it my contribution to your daughter's happiness." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "That's more kindness than we've shown you. More than we deserve to ask." After Sarah left, promising to return in 3 days, Eleanor spread the wedding dress across the kitchen table and began her assessment of the needed repairs. The lacework was indeed delicate, requiring the kind of patient attention she had learned from her mother back in Missouri. As she worked, Martha moved around the kitchen, beginning preparations for the simple lunch they would share. She wasn't the only one, Martha said quietly. "Tom Bradley's wife stopped by yesterday while you were at the well. Seems their boy tore his Sunday shirt, and she wondered if you might be able to make it presentable again." Eleanor looked up from her stitching, understanding beginning to dawn. "They're testing me. Testing us. Maybe," Martha agreed. "Or maybe they're just desperate for good needlework. Heaven knows this town hasn't had anyone skilled with thread and needle since old Mrs. Patterson died last spring." The first fat raindrops began to fall as Eleanor worked, pattering against the window like tiny drumbeats of change. By midday, the rain was coming down in earnest, turning the dust of Perdition Creek's main street into mud that would dry hard as adobe when the sun returned. Eleanor watched the water wash over the town and thought about renewal, about the way desert flowers bloomed after rare storms, painting the harsh landscape with unexpected beauty. That evening, as they shared a dinner of beans and cornbread made rich with the last of Martha's hoarded butter, Eleanor made her decision. "I'm not leaving," she said. Martha paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "What?" "I'm not going back east. I'm not running away to California, or we're trying to find some other place to start over. I'm staying here." Eleanor set down her spoon and looked directly at Martha. "If you'll have me as a partner, I want to turn this boarding house into something honest. Something that serves the people who need it." Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying Eleanor's face in the lamplight. "This isn't an easy place to make a life. The summers are brutal, the winters can be harsh, and the people, well, they're slow to forgive and slower to trust." "Good," Eleanor said. "I'm not interested in easy anymore. Easy got me a ticket to marry a dead horse thief. I want something real, something I can build with my own hands." Martha smiled then, The first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from her since that night when they burned Samuel's lies. What did you have in mind? They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming as the rain continued to fall. They would expand the sewing business, taking in work from neighboring towns if necessary. Martha would continue running the boarding house, but they would be selective about their guests, offering fair prices and honest service to travelers who needed rest and safety. Eleanor would use her education. She could read and write better than most people in Perdition Creek to help with correspondence and bookkeeping. There's one more thing, Eleanor said as they prepared to climb the stairs to bed. The garden plot behind the house. Nothing's ever grown there, has it? Martha shook her head. Ground's too hard. Not enough water. Eleanor looked toward the back door, where she could hear rain pooling in the courtyard where they had burned Samuel's letters. I want to try anyway. Plant something good where something bad used to be. The next morning dawned clear and washed, the air so clean it seemed to ring like a bell. Eleanor took Martha's old hoe and began the backbreaking work of breaking ground that had been baked hard by years of sun and neglect. She worked in the spot where the wash basin had held burning lies, turning the ashen-rich earth until her hands blistered and her back ached. Martha watched from the kitchen window, then joined her with a bucket of precious water saved from the rain. Together, they planted seeds Eleanor had bought with her last few coins, beans and squash and desert marigolds that might survive the harsh climate if tended with care. As they worked, people began to stop and watch. Children pressed their faces to fence posts, curious about the strange sight of two women planting hope in barren ground. Sarah Wilkins brought her daughter Margaret to see the wedding dress repairs and stayed to admire the neat rows of planted seeds. Deputy Bradley tipped his hat grudgingly when he passed, no longer looking at Eleanor like she might pull a hidden weapon. You think anything will grow? Martha asked as they watered the freshly planted ground. Eleanor looked up at the sky, where more rain clouds were gathering on the horizon. The hanging tree still stood in the center of town, its rope removed, but its presence unchanged. Samuel Crawford was still dead, still branded a thief, and Eleanor was still the mail-order bride who had arrived too late for anything but grief. But something had changed in Perdition Creek. Something small and fragile, like the first green shoots that would push through hard earth in search of sunlight. In the space between truth and lies, between guilt and forgiveness, between the life she had planned and the life she was choosing to build, Eleanor had found something that felt like home. Yes, she said, pressing her palm against the warm earth they had just blessed with water and hope. I think it will. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and sage and the possibility of things growing in places where nothing had grown before. In the distance, the hanging tree creaked once in the breeze, then fell silent, as if it too understood that its time of judgment was over, and something new was taking root in the hard ground of Perdition Creek.